Definition and nature of letters of credit. A letter of credit is a financial device developed by our merchants as a convenient and relative safe mode of dealing with sales of goods to satisfy the seemingly irreconcilable interests of a seller who refuses to part with goods before he is paid. And of course, we have the buyer who wants to have a control over the goods before paying. So to break the impasse, the buyer may be required to contract a bank to issue a letter of credit in favor of the seller, so that by virtue of the letter of credit, the issuing bank will now authorize, he can now authorize the seller to draw a drafts and engage to pay them upon presentment simultaneously with the tender of documents required by the letter of credit. So in here, the buyer and the seller agree on what documents are to be presented. For this is necessary for the payment of the goods. But of course, ordinarily, they are documents of title evidencing or attesting to the shipment of the goods to the buyer. So once the credit is established, the seller now will ship the goods to the buyer, and in process secures the required shipping documents or anything that will prove ownership over the goods. To get paid, the seller now will execute a draft and present it together with the required documents to the issuing bank. The issuing bank, will now redeem the draft, babalik na sa kanya, and pays cash to the seller if it finds that the documents submitted by the seller conform, it should be conform with what the letter of credit requires. So the bank now, obtains possession of the documents, and of course it will now, upon there will be a payment to the seller, the transaction is completed. Remember this, the transaction is completed when the buyer reimburses the issuing bank and acquires the documents entitling him to the goods. So that is the end of the transaction. So remember that under this arrangement, the seller gets paid only if 1. He delivers the goods over the goods. 2. The buyer acquires the said documents and control over the goods only after reimbursing the bank. So there must be a reimbursement, on the part of the party. For example, Ricardo mortgaged his fish pond to AC Bank to secure a 1 million loan. In a separate transaction, he opened a letter of credit with the same bank for 500,000 pesos in favor of HS Bank. So yung first bank is AC Bank. The second bank is the HS Bank, which this HS Bank is a foreign bank. So the purpose of such letter of credit is to purchase outboard motors. Likewise, Ricardo executed a surety agreement in favor of AC Bank. The outboard motor arrived and were delivered to Ricardo, but he was not able to pay the purchase price thereof. Question: can AC Bank take possession of the outboard motors? Answer: AC Bank cannot take possession of the outboard motors. A letter of credit is a mere financial device developed by merchants as a convenient and relative safe mode of dealing with sales of goods to satisfy the seemingly irreconcilable interests of a seller who refuses to part with his goods before he is paid, and a buyer who wants to control over the goods before he pays. As such, the mere opening of a letter of credit does not vest ownership of the outboard motors in the bank in the absence of a trust receipt agreement. Question number 2. Can AC Bank also foreclose the mortgage over the fish pond? Okay, the answer there is yes. In order to enforce payment of the principal loan of 1 million secured by the real estate mortgage on the said fish pond. Always remember that the governing law of letters of credit transactions there are two. First is the Code of Commerce provided under Article 567 to 572, and the customs, okay? Principally, the rules found in the Uniform Customs and Practices, or the UCP. Of course, we have also some on the provisions of the banking laws. Question: is a letter of credit a commercial transaction? The answer there is yes. A letter of credit is a commercial transaction. The Code of Commerce contains provision on letters of credit which are still in force. Question: is it governed by the negotiable instruments law? The answer is no. A letter of credit is not a negotiable instrument because it is not payable to order or to bearer, and it is generally conditional. Okay? Hence, it is not governed by the negotiable instruments law. So, remember, okay, there are three parties involved in the letters of credit. Generally, we have the buyer, the bank, and the seller. The buyer is the party that procures the letters of credit and obliges him to reimburse the issuing bank upon presentment or upon receipt of the document of title. While a bank, the second party is the bank. The bank is the party that issues, okay, the letters of credit. So the buyer is the one who will procure the letter of credit. The bank is the one who will issue the letter of credit, okay, which undertakes to pay the seller upon receipt of the draft. So the bank is the party who will pay the seller upon receipt of the draft. Number 3 is the seller. Okay, seller is the party, of course, in compliance with the contract of sale, is the party that ships the goods to the buyer and delivers the document of title to the issuing bank. So remember the three parties. Those parties are the very important have very important roles in a letters of credit. Of course, we also have the advising bank, confirming bank, paying bank, and negotiating bank. We have this so-called doctrine of independence in a letters of credit. Okay? Under the doctrine of independence, what characterizes a letter of credit as distinguished from other accessory contracts is the engagement of the issuing bank to pay the seller once the draft and the required shipping documents are presented to it. In turn, this arrangement assures the seller of the prompt payment, independent of any breach of the main sale contract. By this so-called independence principle, the bank determines compliance with the letters of credit only by examining the shipping documents presented. It is now precluded from determining whether the main contract is actually accomplished or not. You can find this in the case of BA versus Court of Appeals 228 Iskra 357. We also have the so-called fraud exception principle. Under this fraud exception principle, a creditor who is not a party to a contract can sue to rescind the contract to prevent fraud upon him, or the same creditor can instead choose to enforce the contract if a provision in the contract allows him to collect his claim and thus protect from fraud. You can find this in the case of Caltex versus Pinnock. Last is the doctrine of compliance or strict compliance. In the case of Transfield versus Luzon, the Supreme Court said that the letter of credit evolved as a mercantile specialty, and the only way to understand all its facets is to recognize that it is an entity unto itself. The relationship between the beneficiary and the issuer of the letter of credit is not strictly contractual, because both privity and a meeting of the minds are lacking. Yet, strict compliance with each other's term is an enforceable right. Thus, upon receipt by the issuing bank of the documents of title which conform with the letters of credit, what the letter of credit requires, it is now duty bound to pay the seller.